So, welcome to Jumbo IS and welcome back to our lecture series called Daily News in Shorts. In this lecture series, we cover a particular day's current affairs in a very short span of time within 20 minutes. Now, today we are going to be covering August 9, 2024's current affairs, and the important news items that featured in today's newspaper are as following. So, let's take a look at the topics of the day that we are going to cover in this lecture. Number one, there is this situation of heat wave in Antarctica, and right now Antarctica is going through its winter. It's peak winter season in Antarctica, but temperatures are quite high. So, what are the causes behind this Antarctica's deep winter heat wave? We'll talk about this. Then, recently, Sheikh Hasina, former Prime Minister of Bangladesh, came to India. She was seeking asylum in UK, but due to certain technical roadblocks, she is going to stay in India for a long period of time now. Now, this brings into question India's refugee policy because Sheikh Hasina is kind of a refugee, asylum seeker in India. So, what is India's refugee policy? We'll take a look at that. Then, recently, RBI's Monetary Policy Committee meeting happened, and they have come out with their decision. And they have decided to keep the policy repo rate, unchanged. Yes, people were expecting that RBI will reduce repo rate to boost economic activity, but RBI has said that we won't reduce repo rate because inflation is still quite high and reducing repo rate might increase inflation. So RBI is keeping inflation its priority. So we'll talk about this issue. And there is this new bill which will change the regulation of Waqf properties. Now, what are Waqf properties? What are the changes proposed in the law? We'll talk about this issue. Okay, so without much delay, without further ado, let's start with topic number one, which is Antarctica's deep winter heat wave. All right. Now, it's been 2 years since Antarctica has been facing heat wave like situation. It is for the second time in 2 years, a record breaking heat wave is sweeping through Antarctica at the height of its winter season. As you guys all know, Antarctica lies in the southern hemisphere, right? And southern hemisphere, the seasons in southern hemisphere are quite the opposite to northern hemisphere. When it's our winters, southern hemisphere faces summers, and when it's our summers, they face winters. So Australia, Antarctica, it's winter season right now, and during December, January, it is going to be summer season there. So Antarctica is facing its winters, and ground temperatures are at least 10 degrees Celsius higher than normal. In some places, it is even 28 degrees Celsius higher than normal. So if average temperatures during winter seasons are minus 50 degrees Celsius, then in some places it has gone to 22 degrees Celsius as well. Okay, minus 22 degrees Celsius. Now you might think that it's minus 22 degrees Celsius. How can you call it a heat wave? But heat wave is not decided by temperatures. It is decided by the deviation from average temperatures. Okay, so generally during this time, Antarctica is used to these temperatures, minus 50 degrees Celsius, minus 60. But it's now getting to minus 22 degrees Celsius. Now that is an anomaly. Now, what are the major reasons behind this phenomena? Well, North Pole and South Pole, our polar regions, have this thing called polar vortex in its upper atmosphere. Now, because of this polar vortex, cold air gets trapped in the polar region. Okay, so if polar vortex is strong, cold air remains trapped in the polar regions. If polar vortex becomes weak, well, then this cold wave or this cold air dissipates to other areas, and warm air from the upper atmosphere descends to polar regions. And that is why, because of weakening of polar vortex, Antarctica is facing heat wave like conditions. Now, the exact details about polar vortex, the exact conceptual clarity about polar vortex, for that you have to attend our geography lectures. Okay, but some of you who know about polar vortex, well, you would understand this point. And those of you who do not know about polar vortex, just understand this point, that polar vortex is a situation in the upper atmosphere, and when it is strong, winters are quite cold in the polar regions. When it is weak, winters are okay. The other major reason responsible for heat wave like conditions in Antarctica is reduction of Antarctic sea ice. Now, ice sheets in Antarctica are melting already. Now, these ice sheets are white in color, and because of their white color, they are able to reflect back sun's rays, right? Keeping the continent cool. This effect is known as albedo effect. Okay. Now, because these ice sheets are melting, White color is not that prevalent in Antarctica, and because of that, albedo effect has reduced. That is why grounds in Antarctica are absorbing more solar radiations. All right, number one. Number two, what ice sheets do is these ice sheets actually protect the warm water below them. So water is generally warm below these ice sheets, and that is why marine organisms survive. But the air above these ice sheets is cold. Now, when these ice sheets are present, then these ice sheets actually prevent the mixing of cold air and warm water. But if these ice sheets continue to melt, this cold air will absorb heat from warm water and become warm itself. But Antarctic sea ice is reducing rapidly, and that is why warm water is actually raising the temperatures of cold air above it. And that is why heat wave like conditions are there. So these are the two major reasons: polar vortex and reduction in Antarctic sea ice. Now, what are the consequences? Why should we be worried about heat wave like conditions in Antarctica? First of all, if this heat wave persists, then it would lead to more melting of ice sheets. Okay. And when these ice sheets will melt, this would increase the sea levels across the globe. So, melting of ice sheets in Antarctica, because there's a lot of ice packed in Antarctica, if all of this melts, well, this would lead to rise in global sea levels. Okay, which is bad for coastal cities. Okay, because they'll be inundated with water. A sea level rise of only a few feet will displace the roughly 230 million people who live within about 3 feet of high tide line today. Okay, so this is the situation. All right. Plus, there is one more thing. It would lead to impact. It would impact the global ocean circulation system. Now, how would that happen? Look, melting of ice sheets would lead to generation of fresh water, because ice actually ice is basically fresh water frozen, right? When these ice sheets would get melted, fresh water is going to get released. This fresh water would go to sea. This fresh water would reduce the salinity, because seawater is saline, but fresh water would reduce the salinity of sea's surface. All right. Now, when water is saline, it descends downwards because it is highly dense. But when sea salinity decreases, this warm seawater at the surface won't descend downwards. And what would happen? Look, this seawater absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, the surface water, and heat also from the sun. And because it is dense, it descends downwards and traps this carbon dioxide and heat and takes it downwards. Okay, into deep into the sea. But if water salinity is low, okay, this water won't descend downwards. It would absorb CO2 and heat, but it won't descend downwards. And it would lead to lesser capture of carbon and heat from the atmosphere, which would increase more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and further exacerbate global warming. You understand my point? Surface water's salinity would decline, it won't descend downwards, and it won't take carbon dioxide away from the atmosphere. That's about it. And this would increase global warming. So these are the consequences. Now, global warming has a role to play in this heat wave also. A study published in Nature, a magazine called Nature, and Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change both have said that heat wave like conditions are going to be quite frequent in the future as well because of global warming. So that's the entire issue. All right. Now let's straight away jump to new topic, which is India's refugee policy. Now, why is this in the news? Because former Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina will likely remain in India for some time now. Earlier, her plan was to stay in India for a couple of days and then shift to UK because most of her family is in UK. But she is actually seeking asylum in UK. And her application for asylum in UK is facing certain technical problems. So for the time being, she's going to stay in India and India is going to host her. Okay. Now, this brings into question India's refugee policy, because in a way, Sheikh Hasina is a refugee in India. So, first of all, what is a refugee? Who is a refugee, basically? Okay. So, what is a refugee? United Nations Convention on Status of Refugee and its 1967 protocol, they actually give a comprehensive definition of what refugees are. So the definition of a refugee is given in international law, and that international law is known as UN Convention on Status of Refugees. Just remember this. It was released on 1951. Now, according to this definition, who is a refugee? Well, any person who had to leave his or her country, okay, because of safety reasons, because they couldn't live in that area because of safety reasons. And safety regarding what? They feel a threat to their life because of their religion, their caste, their ethnicity, their political views, or their social community. Okay, so if because of these reasons you are not safe in your own country and you have left your country, then you are defined as refugee as per this definition. Now, as per this definition, Rohingya Muslims who had to flee Myanmar were categorized as refugees. Okay. In fact, these Rohingyas, they actually fled Myanmar and came to Bangladesh. Okay. And that is why Cox's Bazar is a place in Bangladesh which is the largest refugee camp in the world because it hosts so many Rohingya Muslims. Now, what is India's situation with respect to refugees? Now, first of all, you need to realize that India did not sign this convention. India is not a part of this convention. Okay, India neither signed this convention, and if India hasn't signed this convention, then there's no question of ratifying it. So India has neither signed it nor ratified it. Plus, there is no law with respect to refugees in India. Okay, so if United Nations Convention on the Status of Refugees gives a definition of refugees, India doesn't believe in that definition because, well, India did not sign this convention. Okay, now this gives a sort of freedom to India because it is up to India now to decide who is refugee and who is not. The countries who have signed this convention, well, they have to abide by it. And this convention actually creates an office of United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Okay. So there is this office called United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And if this High Commission actually calls a particular community a refugee, like for example, they called Rohingyas as refugee, well, then signatories of this convention would also treat them as refugees. But since India has not signed the convention, therefore, when this office actually declared Rohingyas as refugees, India did not believe it. India said, well, we have the freedom to declare refugees ourselves. Okay. Now, India has welcomed refugees in the past. There are around 3 lakh refugees in India. Some are Tibetans, Chakmas from Bangladesh, Buddhist Chakmas, refugees from Afghanistan, Sri Lanka. But India is not a signatory to this convention. Now, this has allowed India some freedom. If India wants certain people, it will call them refugees. If India does not want some people, they would call them illegal immigrants. Okay, like in the case of Rohingyas. United Nations High Commission for Refugees actually called Rohingyas refugees, but India said we'll prosecute them as illegal immigrants and we will deport them as per Foreigners Act or Indian Passport Act. There is no law with respect to refugees. The closest law to a refugee law in India is Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019, under which persecuted minorities of Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, non-Muslim minorities, are allowed citizenship in India. Right? This is the closest to India's refugee policy. Else India does not have a refugee policy as well. Okay, India decides on case-to-case basis. So you just have to remember this fact. All right. Now let's move on to our third news item, which is RBI keeps repo rate unchanged. In its August meeting, RBI's Monetary Policy Committee decided to keep interest rates unchanged, and RBI decided to maintain its stance of withdrawal of accommodation. Now there are two types of stance: accommodative. Accommodative stance means RBI wants to increase money supply, and they will do that by reducing repo rate. Withdrawal of accommodation or tight monetary policy stance, withdrawal of accommodation or tight, means RBI wants to reduce money supply, and that is done by increasing repo rate. Okay. Now RBI has decided to keep its stance same, withdrawal of accommodation, that is tight. That means people were expecting RBI to shift to accommodative by reducing repo rate and increasing money supply. But RBI has said that we will stick to this monetary policy stance. And the reason for that is RBI says that inflation is still a big problem in India. Okay. And in future, inflation might increase. So to control inflation, we will keep interest rates high. Because if RBI reduces repo rate, inflation would skyrocket. So to control inflation, RBI has kept policy rates unchanged. So these are the reasons, major reasons. First of all, there is high food inflation. Okay. And RBI has actually, it's mandatory for RBI to keep inflation between 4% plus minus 2%, CPI based inflation. but inflation is right now 5%. So RBI is a bit alarmed, and the reason is high food inflation. So RBI has kept repo rate similar because it does not want to increase inflation. Remember, whenever RBI will reduce repo rate, it will increase inflation. Okay, so RBI has kept this constant. All right. Then core inflation, core inflation is quite high. Okay, sorry, core inflation is quite subdued. Core inflation is subdued. Food inflation is high. But RBI feels that if food inflation remains high for longer periods of time, then this would increase core inflation as well. Basically, inflation is a big. Now, RBI reduces repo rate. Right now, it is not reducing repo rate, but RBI generally reduces repo rate because RBI wants to boost economic activity. But RBI is saying that economic growth is good at this moment. So we can focus on inflation and keep repo rates unchanged. Okay, so this is the main issue. All right. Now, is there any scope for future rate cuts to boost economic activity? Yes, because it is said that food prices, global food prices have declined, and uh, mandi prices of various food crops are also going to decline. Plus, various central banks across the world are reducing interest rates, so RBI has room to cut interest rates in the future. All right. Okay. And last news item: changes to Waqf Law. Okay. Now, the government on Thursday referred Waqf Amendment Bill to Joint Committee of Parliament. This will amend Waqf Act. Opposition parties are criticizing it because they say it is anti-minority. Now, what is Waqf? Basically, Waqf is actually Waqf property, to regulate Waqf property. Now, what is Waqf property? Well, let's suppose you are a Muslim, right? And you want to donate your property for religious purposes or charitable reasons, Islamic charity. Okay, so you donate your property. Your property will be donated for religious reasons and it will be called Waqf property. So it is a personal property given by Muslims for a specific purpose, religious, charitable, or for private purpose. Okay. Now, in Islam, it is considered that this property is owned by God Himself, Allah Himself. This property is owned by Allah, but it is managed by people on the ground. Okay. Now, this property can be transferred to Waqf. Your personal property can be transferred to Waqf either through a deed, okay, or orally also. Once a property is declared Waqf, its character changes forever. You will lose control over it, okay, and it cannot be reversed. Now, what is the entire situation? How are they governed? First of all, Waqf properties are governed by Waqf Act, and Waqf Act has a history. It started in 1913. Okay, this act, Muslim Waqf Validating Act. Currently, it is being regulated by Waqf Act 1995. There is a survey commissioner which actually makes a list of Waqf properties. Waqf properties managed by a mutawalli, caretaker. Okay. Waqf Act states that any dispute related to Waqf properties will be decided by Waqf Tribunal, which will be made by state government, which will have 3 members. Mostly all are Muslims. Okay, because it's a Muslim thing. Okay. Law also has provisions for constitution and appointment of Waqf boards. Now, these Waqf boards actually manage the property. Waqf councils, CEOs, Waqf boards in the states. CEOs and parliamentarians who are part of Waqf boards must be from Muslim community. Okay. Now, this is the current situation. But what government is trying to do is government is trying to bring certain changes to this Waqf Act. One change is that non-Muslims can also be part of this Waqf board. Okay. That is why opposition members and Muslim community members are opposing this, that non-Muslims can be a part of this. Plus, if there is a dispute regarding Waqf Act, for example, there is this government property, not private property, government property that has been declared Waqf property, then the case will not go to Waqf tribunal, it will go to district collector as far as government properties are concerned. Okay, so you're snatching away some powers from Waqf tribunal. So that is why these are the two controversial provisions, and that is why it is being considered a controversial bill. Opposition members are saying this is anti-minority, government is saying this is closer to rule of law. That's the entire. All you need to know is that what is Waqf property, that's all. And it is regulated by Waqf Act. All right. And with that, we conclude today's session. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. And I hope it has added value to your preparation, though it would add more value if you are consistent, regular with it. Make it a part of your daily routine. All right. I'll see you next time with current affairs from August 10th newspaper. Thank you, everyone.